morning, everyone. My name is Laura Hines. I'm honored to be here to have a conversation with you about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. First, I just want to take a moment to thank you for being interested in this topic. Our research is telling us that it's more common than we recognize, and we'll talk about the ways in which we struggle with recognizing FASD and that it's often underreported and often undersupported. So the fact that we are here having this reflection about what it is, how it's caused, how we can identify it, what are things that we can do as part of the social service industry, it means that we're going to identify more folk and hopefully help them have the successful outcomes that they deserve. That being said, this is considered a foundational course because it is recorded and it's just you and me. We will be going a little more swiftly than we did on the April 4th offering where it was a 2-hour event. This will be much shorter. But the thought was if people were not present at that April 4th event, then this information will be very important and helpful for them as we drill down in the rest of the series. So there will be other offerings that specifically speak to the work that people do that are teachers and counselors. There'll be one specifically for child welfare workers. There will be one for law enforcement entities, as well as for foster and adoptive parents of youth living with FASD. So because we want you all to have the information about FASD before participating in those, we're creating this opportunity here. So my name is Laura Hines. I was historically a pediatric medical social worker for over 10 years and worked with a population that also had some struggles with substance use, worked with some parents living with alcohol use disorder, also support moms who are living with substance use disorder currently and have had a lot of experience working with youth affected by FASD, including, as you might hear in my mention, my brother is also living with FASD. And so this culminates in the information that is going to be presented today, hopefully with examples that feel accessible and recognizable to you, as well as information that feels empowering. So that being said, I'm going to pull up my slides now to get us started. Thank you for your patience as I do that. Wonderful. Here we go. So, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder 101. I've introduced myself just to let you know. This is, again, a part of a multi-part series. Some folks will take all of the parts. Some folks will only take the part that's most germane and relevant to them. You're welcome to do what feels best. Do know that these slides will be made available to anyone who would like to see them. And there'll be a toolkit available as well. So if you are interested in that, just feel free to contact MACC and we will make sure that you get a copy. So MACC, the Multi-Ethnic Advocates for Cultural Competence, are the ones who have sponsored and created this presentation, also with OMHAS as one of the funders. So they serve the state of Ohio and the nation as a nonprofit leader in identifying barriers and offering and implementing solutions to healthcare access, employment, and equity in all sectors. Their mission is to help individuals and organizations embrace, achieve, and benefit from diversity and equity. Their vision is leading communities into a future that's empowered by equity and the endless value that it creates, because discrimination in any form harms people, communities, and the economy. And their approach is to create a network of professionals who are dedicated to collective learning, advocacy, activism, power sharing, and multi-ethnic representation. So please note, I don't think it's as relevant here in terms of recording and photography as this is already being recorded, but we do ask that you not reproduce this in any way, shape, or form. Feel free to watch it over again or to share the link with a colleague who might be interested, but please don't make your own copy. At the end of this, you will be provided a copy of the resources. So there will be the slides. There's also a toolkit that was created that gives you more actionable steps. So yay. There will not be Cs or CLEs associated with this, as far as I know. If that changes, it'll be noted clearly when you register for this. And this training is intellectual property of MACC. So on that note, here's what to expect. By the end of our time together, my hope is that you'll feel empowered to summarize the most recent research related to the causes and presentations of FASD, that you will feel equipped with information about the financial, social, and health-related impacts of FASD on children and on our society as a whole, and feel empowered to recite the sociocultural realities that serve as socially determined risk factors for FASD and how they may foster barriers to the prevention, identification, and intervention with this spectrum disorder. So we're going to break it down. We've already done the welcome and who MACC is, but we'll talk next about what is FASD specifically, what's its impact, what contributes to it, and what it is that we as professionals can do. I've already introduced myself. Hi. Let's keep moving. All right, so what is FASD? Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a diagnosis that's given to a cluster of symptoms ranging from mild to severe, and they all are the result of prenatal alcohol exposure, also known as PAE. So it is hard to identify. The specific amounts of alcohol are undetermined. This is very challenging for those of us who are looking for a marker, would like to know specifically how much alcohol can result in FASD. It's really different for every person. It depends on their metabolism, how it is that they process alcohol, how much they drink, their size, their weight, their history of drinking, their age. So all of these things, and we'll talk a little bit further about those, make it really hard to identify whether or not FASD is at play in the life of an individual. There are sometimes physical characteristics. We will look at those characteristics in a moment. And then the symptom severity and dysfunction may vary from child to child as well as from family to family. And we'll talk more about how a family system impacts outcomes for these individuals. So anytime you see a bolded, colored statement with a line underneath it, it means that there is a link there. Please feel free to follow that link to more information. So I have a link to a full developed explanation around FASD, all the different categories, all of the bits and pieces that we are going to review here together. But if you want a condensed version, you can click that link and it will take you to that. So there are technically 4 distinct diagnoses that cover this spectrum of FASD. So the earliest part of the spectrum, because if it's a continuum, and here's the most severe, is partial fetal alcohol spectrum. So partial fetal alcohol syndrome, or on the spectrum, is the mildest version of FASD. So you'll see fewer of the cluster of symptoms. Those folks tend to have better health and social outcomes than folks that have more severe versions of the diagnosis. Fetal alcohol spectrum is more distinct. Alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or ARND, is very serious, right? How your neurology is developed and is functioning is definitely impacted by the alcohol or ethanol in your mom's system when you were developing, or your person's system, being gender inclusive there. And then there's alcohol-related birth defects, ARBD, which is considered the most extreme. It's evaluated across 4 domains. So we look at 4 separate things in order to identify it: prenatal alcohol exposure, facial structure, growth, both prenatal when you are in term and developing during pregnancy, as well as once you're born, both your body and your brain, to see whether or not that growth impacts how it is that you function. And then cognitive or neurobehavioral development, how your brain works and thinks and your mind processes information, as well as how your brain is organized, what parts are developed versus potentially underdeveloped. So when we are looking at FASD, these are the things that help us recognize the impact that it's having on a person, which would determine one of those 4 diagnoses up above. So here are some symptoms of FASD. So these are taken from Wattendorf and Munke, some of the initial studiers of FASD back in 2005 when we were really having more conversations and we were starting the process of collecting data about FASD. So the next slide has some more recent research, but these still hold, so to speak. Failure to thrive. This is when an infant is born and they're not developing in tandem with their peers, that they are having deficits or challenges. They're often small, they're not gaining weight, their head circumference is not growing at the rate it needs to. Mental disabilities, abnormally small at birth weight, central nervous system abnormalities, and social and behavioral challenges. Again, remembering that it's a cluster of symptomology. These are things that could be in the cluster for that specific person. It's important to note not everyone will have all of these, but they will have several of these. So some of our more recent research indicates that these youth also have trouble sleeping or increased agitation, deficits in cognition, challenges with executive functioning, so self-governance, planning, step-by-step decision-making, things of that nature. Many struggle with auditory processing, meaning that the information they gather via their auditory system does not support them, is not always clear, does not get coded well for them to be able to retrieve it. There's also been identified challenges in motor skills, especially fine motor skills. So they may struggle with running, be discoordinated, uncoordinated, may struggle with holding things and writing. So holding a pencil might be a challenge for them. Um, Tracing things might be harder for them. Some will have issues with their heart or other organs. Many will have challenging uh, issues relating to other people. So we're finding that they can sometimes struggle navigating and understanding other people's behavior. Some of that is due to their attention issues that we'll talk about later. So being able to attend to someone, to read them, to understand the dynamic happening between them and another is something that can be strained, missing, or weak for someone living with FASD. And for some, there are visual markers, meaning that there are changes to appearance related to FASD that are commonly clustered in people with FASD. And we'll look at some images to talk that through. And many have challenges with attachment. So just want to honor that that's a reality that I think when we think about people having challenges understanding others' behavior, that can lead to not attaching. But we also find that the infants who are born with FASD struggle with connecting to their caregivers, which then creates lifelong challenges for those folks. So it's important to note, though I did reference children a lot, this is considered a lifelong disorder, especially without any intervention. So these things will continue across the lifespan if there's no intervention. So what some of these wind up looking like is an impairment in ability to make decisions, impairment with self-determination. They are often extremely influenced by other people, which we can leverage when we recognize that and can support them. But if we don't recognize that, it might be very confusing to people engaging with someone living with FASD as to why it seems that they don't seem to make solid decisions or stay centered in their decisions or seem to go along with a lot of what's happening around them. There's also challenges discerning social value of their behavior. They don't always understand their impact on others and the responses they get from what it is that they have done or said. They have trouble deciphering relational gains, like I'll do this for you and you'll do this for me, and then we'll support each other, is a concept that feels really hard often for folks with FASD. They present with immature moral development, which essentially means that they are coming at a right, wrong, good, bad binary, as opposed to being able to understand doing something for the greater good or doing something to help others because it benefits me as well. That is often considered too high a concept for their developmental level. Then we see things like inattention, impulsivity, highly reactive to changes in their environment when it comes to their senses. So if the temperature changes quickly, they may have strong reactivity to that. With children, it looks like dysregulation because they don't have words for it. So you might see acting out, you might see tantruming if something tastes too strong for them, or brushes against their skin in a way that's really dysregulating. For adults, you'll often hear a lot of complaining and hyper focus on whatever that change is. Like if it's too cold, it's all they can talk about. They're very distracted. They're not able to shake that distraction to participate in whatever is happening around them. There's also often an inability to calm down or regulate their central nervous system. So when folks with FASD get upset, they can stay upset, and it's harder for them to pivot and come back to a homeostasis of functioning. So I have feelings about sharing images of children, especially when I'm not sure of their consent. Um, and I think that as we are attempting to identify and support individuals who may have FASD, that it is also important for us to recognize some of the features associated with it. And so I honor that I am showing these images and hope that we will use them with respect and dignity, as well as letting them empower us to be present for folks who might be living with this disorder and efforts to help them and offer them the best services available. That being said, what I do appreciate about this collection of images is that it shows multi-ethnicities. And that then I think helps really elucidate and clarify what are things that are more associated with FASD versus this child, right? So all of these children have very similar looks to them that are represented by shortened noses, underdeveloped jaws, small eye opening, thin upper lips, and very flat mid-face. So not every person who's living with FASD has these characteristics, but of those, there is a population that does have what's called dysmorphia or markers linked to the amount of alcohol that was ingested by their parent during the developmental part of the pregnancy associated with feature development. So if you would like more information or want to see these images and any more information about them, there is a link here. Um, so let's talk about prevalence. I think these stats are really interesting. FASD is thought to occur globally at a rate of 0.77%, which is not a significant, well, it's significant to the person living with it, but and when it comes to World Health considerations, it is a small part of the global population. However, it's really interesting and important to note that in North America and the United Kingdom, which means US, Canada, Mexico, as well as the United Kingdom, it's 2 to 5%. So sorry, Mexico's technically considered part of moving into South America, but this part of Central America and above, it's 2.5%, which is a significantly different statistic from 0.77%. These numbers are likely low due to concerns that mothers underreport. They often miscalculate how much alcohol they ingest during pregnancy, and sometimes parents misrepresent their actual alcohol use during pregnancy, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But those realities lead us to expect that these numbers are actually lower than the actual rates. There's also realities that these statistics are determined by who comes in and reports their alcohol use during pregnancy. And if you don't come in to a prenatal provider, you may not be captured. So we know that people struggling with alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder tend to have more no-shows to their appointments for prenatal care than those folks who are not struggling with those disorders, which then means we're also missing data. from individuals who may not be getting care because they're struggling with their substance use disorder or their alcohol use disorder, and therefore they're not being counted in some of these statistics. So I really appreciate this statement made by May et al. In their first article of 2020. Virtually all quantity measures of drinking during pregnancy appear to have been underreported by pregnant mothers in comparison to the control group. So every time they were asked how much they were drinking, people tend to miscalculate. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. There's a lot of confusion as to what a standard drink is. It's generally 1 ounce of alcohol, but then we're talking how much content. So what does that mean if you're drinking 6 hard seltzers, or a glass of wine versus 1 glass of pure alcohol like whiskey or gin? So all of those things mean that people aren't calculating their alcohol intake very well in general, and therefore they're not necessarily reporting it very accurately. So if we go in with the mindset that no alcohol usually means some alcohol, and some alcohol means a bit more than they might realize, then we can pay attention in a way that might help us identify more families that need support in reference to their alcohol use. So here are some things we know. Some of this varies from researcher to researcher, so I want to acknowledge this. But the thought is that 3 drinks a day in pregnancy has a high correlation with a child being born with FASD. 5 drinks a day is considered one of the standard definitions for FASD. Now, 5 drinks a day don't necessarily have to come in 5 separate glasses, right? If somebody does a heavy pour in 1 glass, there might be the equivalent of 3 ounces of alcohol in that glass. So they may feel like they've had 1 drink, but really they've had 3 in that 1 drink, and then the next one might put them at 5 or higher. The higher the presence of other substances, the higher the risk of FASD. So just knowing this co-occurrence, and so paying attention to that as we are looking to support and identify families that might be affected by FASD. FASD is not easily spaced from alcohol-related neurobiological disorder, ARND, right? But which means that when we think about this spectrum, it's not clear where you have to fall in order to be in one part of the spectrum disorder versus the other. So it's not clear when you go from FASD to ARND. However, 100% of people affected with ARND, so that's the alcohol-related neurobiological development, are born premature. So if a child is born to a parent who was living with alcohol use or practicing imbibing alcohol during pregnancy, and they have the child prematurely, there is a higher chance that infant has ARND, because all of the folks who have ARND were born premature. Now, they might still fall on the spectrum, but not have ARND. But if you have ARND, you were also born prematurely. There is an 80% chance of premature labor with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and that has its own hosts of challenges. And youth who have been diagnosed with partial fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, it still keeps them on that spectrum, right? So even if they are functioning with more success and achievement, or without as much need of support than other folks, they're still considered on the FASD spectrum. Now, I just want to talk about some social determinants of FASD. So, heavy drinking before pregnancy, also known as more than 4 drinks in a setting. Heavy drinking when pregnant. So, part of this heavy drinking before pregnancy is because very often people don't know they're pregnant initially. And so, if you are generally a heavy drinker and then you get pregnant and you don't know it, you're likely heavy drinking while pregnant, and therefore have a higher risk of having a child with FASD. When you're pregnant, having 4 or more drinks per sitting is highly correlated with FASD. If someone is using other drugs while pregnant, that also increases the risk. We have found that white non-Hispanic women in their 20s were identified as binge drinking more during pregnancy, and non-Hispanic Black women are more consistently identified as drinking during pregnancy. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily drinking more. And white non-Hispanic women in their 20s who are identified as binge drinkers are not always identified as having risk of FASD while pregnant, and that is because they're not consistently identified. So we'll talk more about what creates skewed statistics in reference to who actually gets identified as being in danger of having a child with FASD. Partnership violence is a risk factor. Relationship dissatisfaction is a risk factor, or partners influencing drinking. So having stressors in your relationship are threats, and having a partner who also indulges in drinking, or especially heavy drinking, has been found to be a risk factor for pregnant people of potentially having children with FASD. On the other side, there's some additional information I wanted to share, but I start at the top with how light drinking in pregnancy is associated with material stability and access to care and support. So the more stability and the more access to care and support a parent has while pregnant, the less they're likely drinking, which means it lowers the risk of FASD. So if we're going to do universal precaution or think about this from a public health perspective, we want people who are pregnant to have as much stability, access to food, clothing, shelter, and the care and support that they need during pregnancy so that they are less likely to cope with stress by drinking. We have also found that heavier drinking in pregnancy correlates with the lack of social and fiscal support. So people who are struggling drink more. Prenatal tobacco exposure. So folks that are smokers and are smoking during pregnancy are at a higher risk of also drinking during pregnancy and potentially having a child affected by FASD. We're finding that older moms are more highly associated with FASD than younger moms. The thought is maybe this is related to a lower liver functioning. Our liver functions less well as we age. And maybe that means there's more alcohol in the system being absorbed by the child versus the liver being able to take care of that for families. Lower income areas, again, pairing this with stress, it makes sense. Rural areas where there's not always other things to do outside of drinking. If it's the first child and a parent is not necessarily thinking in a parental way about their bodies and their lives, that can increase the risk. Depression, anxiety, and adversity are all connected as well. I do want to say that there is this key takeaway that who it is that may be affected by FASD tends to be less important than what it is they are struggling with during their pregnancy. So rather than us focusing on someone's gender or someone's ethnic identity or cultural identity, we need to focus on what's happening in their lives and look for the things that might put them in distress and address those things as much as is possible, as that will move the needle in a more effective way than us trying to guess who is or is not drinking during pregnancy. So just wanted to highlight that there are things that do impact the likelihood of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder when it comes to alcohol during pregnancy. The first is how much, so the quantity, how much alcohol is being consumed during pregnancy. The second is at what point in the pregnancy, so timing. Is it early in the pregnancy? Is it in the middle? Is it towards the end? Is it across the spectrum of pregnancy? Those realities impact FASD's presence and negative impact on the child. And then frequency, how often during the pregnancy is someone drinking? These all come into play, which is why it's so very hard to determine what causes FASD, because it might be a different quantity for one person versus a different timing versus a different frequency, and that's really hard to determine. Pre-pregnancy drinking is also a strong predictor of potential alcohol consumption during pregnancy. We did discuss a little bit why earlier. So there are some barriers to identification. One is provider bias related to screening. The other is a lack of standardized cause or markers, which leaves identification up to the provider who is screening. There's often no governmental standardization regarding screening. So without having a universal standard, we struggle. Without having a universal standard when it comes to what it is that makes up FASD, we struggle. There are technically no reliable biological markers for the FASD diagnosis. So you can't just take a blood test and know. There's no genes that are specific to this equals FASD. Without markers, it's really hard. So we're really looking at how the person is affected and how their life is progressing as opposed to something otherwise tangible. The absence of standardized markers and identifiers therefore results in poor screening and, unfortunately, poor provider awareness and intervention. All right, so here are some challenges related to research around FASD. Youth are often identified once they get to school. So that's a challenge, right? First of all, youth need early intervention in order to have the most success or chance of success while living with FASD. But if people are underreporting or not being screened, or providers are not aware to ask the questions and to check in, usually kids are not being identified, and families are not being identified or supported until the child enters school and is struggling in that way. Parents with kids with FASD often report comorbidity with other substance uses. And so sometimes there'll be a hyper focus on what's considered quote unquote harder drugs or illegal substances. And with that hyper focus on the substances versus the alcohol, folks can get missed and not calculated well. Moms who struggle with alcohol use disorder are often less likely to take prenatal vitamins. They tend to struggle with prenatal care or have a late start to their prenatal care than average pregnant moms. And there are no reliable biological markers for the FASD diagnoses, which makes it just harder to catch. However, it's important to note the threat is the same. The risk of delivering a baby with FAS was comparable among white, Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native women at similar levels of drinking during pregnancy. I'm sorry that this statistic is missing the Latinx, Latina, Latin A entities, but I think my understanding is they are counted under white Hispanic. Regardless of race, a 1 gram increase in average alcohol consumption has been identified as resulting in increased odds of giving birth to a baby with facial anomalies or deficient brain growth. So any alcohol during pregnancy is no good, and we want to avoid that. Let's talk about the impact of FASD. So societally, FASD causes enormous quote unquote burden to service systems because there's higher healthcare utilization, the cost of special education, the fact that there is a large involvement with law enforcement. Approximately 60% of adults with FASD were in trouble with the law at some point in their lives. We'll talk more about that in the law enforcement discussion. Children in care, globally high statistics for foster care and orphan children is often directly connected to whether or not a parent or maternal mom used alcohol. There are lost wages, lost productivity for our society with folks who are not engaged in the workforce or not as successful in the workforce because of having unsupported FASD, higher levels of death and early death, all associated with FASD. For children and families specifically, approximately 17% of children in foster care have FASD. It's an important statistic. We'll talk more about that in the child welfare lecture and in the lecture for foster parents and adoptive parents. And unfortunately, maltreatment of youth, both with FASD and trauma, that tends to happen together. That if you have maltreatment in your life and you're living with FASD, you will have more negative impact and outcomes of your FASD. So we want to make sure that youth are safe and supported. There's also the lifelong cost of care till the age of 43, and it's estimated to be over $1 million. And symptoms have lifelong impact. So that's important to note as well. So we need to note that moms are also drinking more in our society. So according to the CDC and SAMHSA, in 2016, approximately 10% of pregnant people reported alcohol use within the past month. About 40% of those people also reported other uses of substances. However, only 10% of all those who needed treatment for their substance use or alcohol use actually received care. So these trends are concerning. We're also hearing things about the popularity of wine mom, right? And people talking about mommy juice being some sort of alcoholic beverage, while their children are having apple juice. We see it on a lot of social media. Alcohol is considered a point of empowerment and a step against patriarchy. So we're hearing all of this language that is indicating that people are drinking more. Women seeing drinking during pregnancy as an empowerment thing or an aspect of self-care. We see increased alcohol consumption as compared to pre-pandemic rates. And there's a culture of binge drinking among military community, both men, women, and people who are in the military, and it is being explored as a public health crisis. So military is America's heaviest drinking population, according to KIME, and up to 20% of military wives report at-risk drinking behavior. So that means that there's a higher risk for FASD as well. So here are some contributions to FASD's negative impact: stigma and bias. When we find bias prevents some mothers and children from being identified, stigma prevents those who need help from getting it. Poor screening, because we have this limited data regarding specific markers, and poor provider awareness around screening. And then poor intervention. If we're not screening, we're not identifying, and we're not helping. So unfortunately, youth are not identified till later in life, often elementary school age, which means valuable time has been lost for them in terms of supporting them. So let's just talk a bit about stigma and bias. Bias prevents some mothers and children from being identified. Stigma prevents them from getting the help they need, right? Wanted to reiterate that here. Stigma related to the social and behavioral causes of FASD prevent mothers from sharing their experiences. So if I'm afraid that you are going to judge me, that you are going to not care for me as well, that you are going to make a report to child welfare when my child is born, I'm less likely to tell you that I'm struggling with alcohol use. So unfortunately, we become barriers. Our stigma, our biases as provider become barriers to people actually getting the help that they need. Despite the equitable rates of FASD risks between Black and white moms, Black moms are screened for substance use at higher rates than white moms are, which not only puts a stigmatizing burden on Black moms, but it does mean that white moms aren't getting the help they need either. Were Black moms to be screened during pregnancy and supported with their alcohol use, it could reduce FASD in their children. Same with white moms. White moms could be identified and supported for their alcohol use and risk of FASD for their children were we doing this in a more equitable way. So a caveat, I just want to be clear, equitable surveillance, meaning everyone being screened, could identify more youth as being affected by FASD and hopefully result in them receiving services. However, research does indicate that it is not likely to decrease the racial discrepancy between races when it comes to who gets reported on. So though we hope that more people will get services, we also anticipate a continued punitive response to Black moms or people who are pregnant versus non-Black. So just something we need to keep in mind as providers. And shame and blame does not decrease FASD, it just impedes treatment. And I just want to take a moment when it comes to shame and blame. There are things that we say that we may not recognize as being shameful or blaming that we need to acknowledge and do better. So one of those things is when we talk about how FASD is 100% preventable, there is stigma within that statement. There's judgment within that statement. And we often find that to be a challenge for people seeking care. And so organizations are paying attention to how they are naming FASD, how they're doing outreach to people, how they're doing outreach to providers to try to lessen this stigma so that people actually come in and get the care that they need. So I want to also share with you now that this bias continues, right? BIPOC mothers report hiding their substance and alcohol use from providers for fear of child welfare involvement, and therefore there's a lost opportunity to help them during pregnancy. And the punitive responses that tend to be leveraged against Black mothers living with substance use disorders, and how those responses lead to termination of parental rights at higher rates than their counterparts, is a scary threat that causes people to not share or not ask for help, honestly, which then what are we here for? If we are not able to meet people where they are and support them, again, we become barriers. So Miles Himmelreich made this statement: FASD is caused when there's alcohol intake during pregnancy. This can happen for a number of reasons, but please know statements like FASD is 100% preventable just leads to more shame and blame. Statements like the child's mother should have cared enough not to drink lead to stigma for the mother and child. My mother drank. I have FASD. This is what I have. It's not who I am. This is what the children and youth in this report have. It is not who they are. And we as providers want to make sure that we are keeping that in mind as we engage with families affected by FASD. Provider bias affects which moms are screened, which moms are believed, which moms are trusted, and which moms are invested in. So we need to make sure our bias is not interfering with a person's ability to get the help they need and for youth born with FASD to be supported. So I've broken up the next couple of slides about poor screening to why pre-pregnancy screening is poor, why during pregnancy screening is poor, and why what we struggle with when it comes to identifying youth that are living with FASD. So pre-pregnancy, looking for a person who might be at risk of FASD tends to not happen as frequently as it probably should. One of the reasons is provider discomfort with discussing alcohol use with patients results in less screening. A lot of folks think it's a morality discussion, that there's a lot of judgment in talking to people about alcohol use, so some providers avoid it and don't check in about it unless they see a liver enzyme count that's concerning. The screening tools sometimes have varying levels of efficacy in actually identifying fetal alcohol syndrome, especially in comparison to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So fetal alcohol syndrome screening tools have been found to be more effective at identifying fetal alcohol syndrome than fetal alcohol spectrum disorder screening tools, and the vast differences in the screening tools approaches results in limited accuracy. Paternal drinking habits are actually a risk factor for genetic changes related to drinking, and providers are not often inquiring about fathers' drinking habits and the effect on maternal drinking. So we're not having a whole family approach in a way that could actually be beneficial. We also know that poor awareness of risk factors are keeping providers from doing any screening at all. And although heavy drinking prior to pregnancy is a key risk factor for drinking during pregnancy and FASD, very few providers screen for FASD with women of birthing age. And one of the recommendations is that we talk to everyone who is birthing age about their alcohol use and ask them to be wary and pay attention to changes in their bodies that might indicate pregnancy, especially if they are heavy drinkers. New recommendations indicate that we should be marketing public health warnings related to alcohol use and potential pregnancy more widely for all childbearing aged women. And half of all pregnancies are unintended. That's really important for us to keep in mind. That means if half of pregnancies are unintended, there's a population of people who aren't trying to get pregnant and aren't living their lives in a way that would support healthy pregnancy because it's not in their plan. It's not what they're thinking about. So when they're not considering their drinking habits, there is a higher chance that they will be drinking during early pregnancy, which will be a potential issue. All right, so poor screening during pregnancy. So why aren't we screening moms and parents who are pregnant? Provider discomfort in discussing alcohol use with patients results in less screening, right? Late pregnancy identification for binge drinking women is a significant consideration regarding whether or not we're screening efficaciously. Low rates of provider awareness results in low rates of screening. Failure to message about FASD to all childbearing age women versus just those intending or who are already identified as being pregnant is a missing spot for us. Some doctors do not ask about alcohol consumption due to their own challenging alcohol use, right? So they avoid it. And denial that FASD occurs in private practice. Now, this is an older statistic, but it is one we keep hearing about, that private practitioners are not screening for FASD because they see this as a problem that affects a population that they don't see. And so they don't even check in. And yet we know that people with money who have private practitioners, a good number drink alcohol. And so there is still a risk of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder occurring in that population. And then there's a general identification of discomfort in addressing women's alcohol use during pregnancy. Now, when little ones are born, we also don't catch them as we ought to or could. And some of that is because we have this lack of clinical clarity related to what marker we should focus on related to the risk of FASD. The racial bias of Child Protective Services reporting on Black women who test positive for alcohol use results in white children whose families were not screened or identified missing out on effective treatment. And the risk of FASD is correlated with lower socioeconomic status versus race, and yet diagnoses fall more clearly along racial lines. The diagnosis fall clearly, not the risk and the actual FASD occurrences. So we identify FASD in BIPOC families at greater rates than white families, but that's because we are looking for it more in BIPOC families than in non-BIPOC families, which again omits some children from identification. I want to take a moment now to talk about conflicts of interest, which equal barriers to folks being identified. Women who fear involvement with the child welfare system are not inclined to share their struggles with alcohol use with their providers. In the military, if you reveal your alcohol use disorder, it could threaten your career. And so people are not necessarily interested in that and in this conflict place. The government acknowledging the binge drinking culture in its military and the threat it has of FASD opens the door to a challenge that would actually require attention and intervention. And if folks are not prepared for that, they don't ask questions. Addressing patients' alcohol use could cause cognitive dissonance for those providers who are struggling with their own alcohol use issues. And then poor intervention, which is the bane of this disorder. Not getting the help you need is devastating for your outcomes in life. The complexity of symptoms and non-standard presentation makes supporting youth with FASD a challenge. Although alcohol use screening and brief interventions have been found to reduce the potential impact of FASD, the issues around screening can deny patients this support. Physicians have been found to be misguided about the actual risk levels of drinking when it comes to FASD. And for children and families, I mentioned approximately 17% of children in foster care have FASD. And when you're in foster care, you're often not getting the help you need on a lot of levels because people are just getting to know you. They don't recognize your symptomology. You're only going to be there for a short period of time. So until you're in your more permanent place, services don't get started. There's so many reasons. And unfortunately, that leaves these kids unsupported. This is problematic and has been identified that children remaining with supportive and connected families is considered a best practice. So children being removed because of the presence of alcohol then takes away one of the primary supports, which is their family of origin. And if we can support those families of origin better, then those children tend to fare better. And provider bias affects which moms are screened, being trusted, or invested in. So what can we do? Where do we go from here? We need to personally do some reflections. We need to focus on strengths-based interventions. We need to understand the needs of the child and their parents. We want to support early detection and early intervention and consider some best practices. So this personal reflection, these are things that I'm asking us as providers to consider. We have to identify our own biases and how that might contribute to or hinder children being identified, and how it might impact our interactions with parents living with alcohol use disorder. Are we judging them? Are we condemning them? Are we avoiding them? How are we doing outreach to them is often tied to how we feel about them. And so making sure our bias does not get in the way of people getting the help that they need. Um, Reflecting on questions like how does my organization's processes around access and utilization support or challenge the realities of families who might be living with FASD? Are there lots of barriers to getting appointments, or is there a significant punitive response if people are late or struggle or miss appointments? Are we kicking people out of care for missed appointments? If so, we are ensuring that they remain disenfranchised. And so we may need to get creative and think of other ways. And it's possible. I've worked with many organizations to help them figure out how to create lower barrier access to care. How do I integrate compassion, collaboration, and a non-judgmental attitude into the work I do with families with FASD? It's an important question. Excuse me. Another question, do I use strength-based processes to help leverage skills, traits, and abilities to address growth points or deficits for folks living with FASD? We need to be able to answer that question. I want to pivot now to talk about the strengths identified with youth living with FASD. And I not only want to offer some hope around this, but if we're going to be strength-based in our interventions, we need to recognize what the strengths are for folks living with FASD. So moving away from this deficit model of examination is often more empowering. So researchers have come together to offer information regarding positive traits observed in youth with FASD. Strong self-awareness. Folks with FASD tend to know that they are struggling or have differences in how they engage with the world or with tasks. They're not as fragile. They are not as ashamed of that unless we make them ashamed. And so we can leverage that self-awareness in a way that offers them alternative skill sets or processes that they can leverage to manage the challenges that they have. They tend to be highly receptive to support. They enjoy attention and being cared for. And if you want to offer them something, they tend to be very positive in receiving it. They tend to persevere through challenges. Some people might call that stubborn. I like to call that determined. But we can help them leverage that towards the completion of tasks that might feel hard or challenging to them. And they tend to hold hope in their future as long as we hold hope in their future. And so we don't want to interrupt any of these strengths with our own negativity. Folks with FASD have been found to have strong adaptive skills that correlate strongly with a strong functioning family unit. So the stronger the family unit, the more effective folks are at trying to figure things out in different ways. They tend to have very sweet dispositions. They are often very loyal, curious, eager to please. They have a love for life, joie de vivre, right? So leveraging that, they tend to be very positive. And so there are ways in which we can support folks by focusing on these. They tend to be easygoing and highly socially motivated. They want to be with people a lot of the time, even if they struggle with being with people or struggle to understand people or struggle to understand their impact with people. So this slide would lead you, if you were to hit the Speaks underline button, to an interview between Resma Menachem and Krista Tippett. Resma is a somatic healer around trauma, and he focuses on how trauma and behaviors that people have are often judged and misinterpreted, and that can prevent us from seeking the data we need to be helpful to them. He speaks specifically about this in minutes 1406 to 1418. It's a fascinating, if you like learning about trauma, it's a fascinating interview period, but at least those minutes are important for this discussion. When we think about what families need, we need to think about context. We need to understand the fullness of who they are and what their challenges are versus distilling them to their symptoms or problems or problematic behavior. So if we don't think in context, right, what Resma says is trauma that's undiagnosed in a person is seen as a character flaw, as opposed to a person who is surviving trauma. Same could be said for FASD. If we don't think more holistically about people, their lives, what got them to this point in time, we're going to miss that full story that might actually help us understand that this person might be living with FASD. He also says that undiagnosed trauma in families looks like family dysfunction, and undiagnosed trauma in communities looks like culture. And FASD kind of functions the same. If we don't look at everything that's happening for the family, we can rule them out as a quote unquote bad family, a dysfunctional family. And that sometimes frees providers from intervening, which is problematic, particularly for this population. So asking caregivers what they need, listening to what they have to say, whether we agree with it or not, is important. Learn the context of their alcohol use. What stressors are happening for them? Can we lessen the stressors so that they feel less need to drink? How do we integrate our information from today to make sure our interventions are context-based and addressing the holistic reality is important. And we want to support parents and caregivers in understanding children's sensitivities and how to foster stimuli tolerance and environmental enrichment for their children with FASD. Okay, so on being FASD informed, it's really important for us to know more information about FASD as providers so that we are thinking about it, we are noticing it, we are looking for symptoms and realities associated with it so that we can help people get help, right? So considering this context and information, the question is, how do we move forward in being FASD informed and best supportive of families affected by this challenging reality? Via early identification, via early intervention, by engaging in best practices related to FASD support and intervention, and by offering support to parents and caregivers. So in order to support early detection, we want to make sure that we don't miss or delay diagnoses for folks that have FASD, because that leads to irreparable challenges because they don't get the help they need. We want to practice universal processes in screening, not our gut deciding who may or may not be affected by drinking or FASD. It's not about what a person looks like or what they present. It's about whether or not they drink. And so if we practice universal processes, we will increase equity and hopefully identify folks that need help more effectively. We also need to acknowledge the racial disparities in Child Protective Services reporting for Black mothers versus white mothers and how this then affects who gets treatment. And ask the right questions related to child's functioning, which means that we may need to ask questions differently from parents who might be living with substance use disorder, asking them maybe to compare their children to other children that they've seen. Are there any similarities? Are there any differences? Asking parents concrete questions with examples of observable behavior or challenges. For example, does your child seem sensitive to sounds? What about when things touch their skin? So that level of clarity versus Is your child sensitive? Does your child struggle with transitions between activities or locations? If so, what does that look like? What happens? Having specific examples can be helpful in this process, considering that using educational videos as opposed to pieces of paper with lots of words on them, which can be intimidating or overwhelming to people, especially those with low literacy. Um, we also have a lot of resources in the toolkit that you'll be sent. So lots of places for videos that you can show people and walk them through and then discuss their understanding of those videos. It's also helpful to mirror the language that parents use about their children because that's their world. That's the language they're most familiar with. So if we can mirror that back to them, we might get more useful information than if we're using, more academic terms. You may need to become an advocate for families living with FASD, helping children affected find the supports and interventions that they need by being FASD informed, and then helping remove the barriers so they can participate in them. Early intervention is key. Although prenatal alcohol exposure causes foundational issues that damage a child's brain and body, children with FASD can often overcome these challenges with the right interventions. Early targeted interventions tailored to a child's specific symptoms can have a positive compounding effect on their brains and their lives. When a symptom is recognized early on, healthcare providers can recommend specific interventions. Let's talk about best practices related to FASD. So, equitable surveillance and effective treatment, meaning universal screening can reduce the impact of bias, and effective identification of families affected by FASD can result in appropriate treatment for youth. Offering youth adaptive skill development to address the challenges that they're experiencing. So rather than holding expectations that are cruel because that youth is going to struggle related to them, we need to support them in finding the alternative strategies that are going to empower them. I'll give an example. We did not have a lot of information about fetal alcohol syndrome, which is what my brother has. Unfortunately, that means that we did not hold fair expectations for him when it came to school. And there was a lot of pressure for him to get math right and to develop these well-written skill sets when it comes to language and expression. And he struggled and wept and was humiliated. And looking back, I so wish that we had just let him use a calculator to figure out how to live in this world and allowed him to use assistive devices and recordings of voice to text, because that's what he's doing now in his life, and he is living a good life. Um, and we could have empowered him to have confidence and to feel good and less shame were we to have empowered him to use these alternative assistive devices. So just recognizing that there are so many opportunities to support in a healthy, healing, effective way that can empower people versus disempowering, shaming them. And we have an opportunity as providers to be a part of that change. So I'm sorry to him and grateful to be here having conversations so that maybe this doesn't happen to someone else who is living with FASD. Supporting people to early interventionists like occupational therapists and recreational therapists for support can be really helpful. We want to destigmatize screening and support for children and families affected by FASD, make it matter of fact. This is what's happening. Here's how we can help. We want to create targeted and individualized interventions to address the particular needs of the child and family because people can have different parts of that symptom cluster. We want to address those parts as opposed to ignoring some things or missing some things or not asking the right questions. And engaging parents in effective treatment is critical to mitigate and disrupt the potential worsening impact for those affected with FASD. Continuing with the best practices, we want to utilize strengths-based approaches with child and family systems. We want to identify and manage the youth sensory diet. What sensations does one get drawn to, what do they hate, what upsets them, and then help them have access to the things that bring them pleasure more, and decrease the access to the things that interrupt their ability to function. We want to support transitions and breaks in routine as much as possible so that folks can be more successful. We want to offer opportunities for success and acknowledge the wins, be positive and strengths-based, right? We want to offer content and information in multiple formats: spoken, written, visual cues, videos, repetition, and have them repeat back to us. All of those things can support learning. Some helpful interventions. It's important to note that many folks with FASD struggle with breaking down certain vitamins. So vitamins B, A, and E tend to not get absorbed the same way. So we want to ensure that they have more access to those vitamins. Choline, DHA, folic acid, selenium, these are all things that can support us in our functioning and are not as accessible to folks that have FASD. So involving medical providers in how to better access these vitamins in the bodies of people affected by FASD is something we can advocate for. Cognitive rehabilitation, helping people to learn differently, to use their brains in ways that their brains can be successful. It can be helpful. There's more information at that link about what cognitive rehabilitation is and what it looks like. Occupational and recreational therapy. I have links to both of those professions so that you can learn what it is and how it is that it can be helpful in terms of making referrals. So, although FASD impacts children differently, researchers have identified some interventions that can support youth and families living with FASD. All researchers agree early intervention is ideal. And there's ways in which we can be supportive as providers. So if you're working with a family that is identified as having a child affected by FASD, and that child is having a lot of reactivity related to stimuli in their environment or their senses, we can work to gradually increase their tolerance of sensory input. Um, there's a lot of handouts and ways in which we can do this in the lecture about for teachers and counselors as well as for foster and adoptive parents. So if you want more information about that, tune in to those. And we have lots of charts and images and activities and resources related to that. Support for deductive and mathematical skills, because folks tend to really struggle with that. And we need to start from a place of realism about those needs and supports instead of idealism. We want to make sure that they're getting support to nutritionally process some of the vitamins that they need. We want to foster parental presence for youth. We want to foster strong attachments and connections between FASD affected youth and their parents. We want to support the family's overall functioning, decrease stressors as much as possible. We want to increase their ability to adapt and adaptive strength development, empowering them to figure out what they need in order to achieve or successfully complete or to do that thing. And that also requires looking at their strengths. And then we want to foster cultural pride and belonging. When people feel like they belong, they feel empowered, they're more likely to develop adaptive skills versus if they feel disenfranchised, disempowered, shamed, blamed, they're not likely to strive or try in the same way. So after this training, these slides will be made available to anyone who'd like them. You can also request the FASD 101 toolkit that has a lot of information. There's a really cool infographic that I spent a lot of time working on and I hope you like, that can be posted in your workspace for other folks to see to kind of increase our FASD informedness. There are lots of resources and links to other organizations. There's also a summary of key points from the slides listed there, and an integration sheet asking us to think about how do we integrate some of this learning, what are things we need to pay attention to leverage our FASD informedness. I'm alone it's just you. I can't hear your questions, but I would like you to also think about integrating this information into your work, into your setting, into your role, and is there ways in which your agency can increase its efforts around FASD? If so, please encourage, advocate, involve them in those reflections and discussions. Um, Thank you for your time. There's a bunch of references here, but I also want to end here. Thank you so much. If you have questions, let Mac know. They can find me and we can get connected and hopefully I can be of service. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. And I hope this feels empowering and supportive and that you'll come back for one of the other sessions happening in the near future. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.